Hello again, everybody. This is Ken Kinter. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University. And the purpose of this presentation is to talk about state psychiatric hospitals from their origins, actually before their origins, to the current day. So as usual, if you like what you're hearing, go tell somebody, and open to feedback as well about other presentations and other topics that might be able to take on in this area. So before we get rolling, I just want to talk about the project that I work for and give credit where credit is due. The project that we are in, the State Hospital Psychiatric Rehabilitation Initiative, or SHPRI, is a connection between the New Jersey Department of Health and Rutgers University with the goal of improving working conditions and improving treatment in New Jersey state psychiatric hospitals. Without their financial and other types of support, what we do simply would not be possible. So to get rolling, we're going to talk about how the mental health system works for people with severe and persistent mental illness, talk about the origins of state psychiatric hospitals, both before them, during them, up to the present day. We will discuss deinstitutionalization, readmissions, the challenges that face these hospitals, and where we've had some wins, and also the work that is left to do going forward. These hospitals are not well known to the majority of the population. They're sort of islands unto themselves. I will be using the examples of New Jersey state psychiatric hospitals because those are the ones I'm most familiar with, although I've had contact with state hospitals in several states. So that's going to be most of the examples. However, I will talk about some national stuff as well. So just to get rolling, how the mental health system, works or is supposed to work, depending on how you want to look at it, is a continuum. And that is, you see up top here, you have the least restrictive, most free settings, the voluntary settings over this line. And then you get into more traditional types of treatment, such as intensive case management services or PAC teams. Then you work below this line and you start to get into admission. So as we get lower down this list, you see things that are far more restrictive. You see jail diversion. And what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation is the very bottom of this, the most restrictive part of this, which are state psychiatric hospitals. The goal of these facilities is to move people up toward the higher parts of it. However, it is understandable that people may move up and down during their illnesses throughout this continuum. But the goal is to move people up and have as few as possible at these lower bottom levels. The system in your state may be different, or your country may be different, but this is basically how it's set up in New Jersey, and it's set up similarly throughout the US. However, it was not always this way. In the early days of colonial America, people with mental illness were largely left to themselves or their families, or they lived sort of at the fringes of town, the fringes of society, or they were just incarcerated or put in poorhouses. And then, thanks in no small part to the efforts of Dorothea Dix, fascinating person to read about, by the way, fascinating. She was the superintendent of nurses for the Union Army in the Civil War. She also advocated to Congress for what was going to become federal psychiatric hospitals to be run by the federal government. However, it ended up being moved down to the state level. So from the period of the 1850s to the 1950s, these hospitals grew, and we'll look at how they've proliferated throughout time. And the hospitals hit their peak in the 1950s, and then since then have been downsized in something called deinstitutionalization, which we'll get into much more detail about as we go. So here comes the development of this thing. Oh, and by the way, if you want to see a recreation of one of these colonial state psychiatric hospitals, I can't recommend highly enough. There's a recreation in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the Guggenheim Museum, and some of the pictures that are in this presentation came from there. That tour is totally worth taking if you work in this field. So originally what happened is psychiatric units were developed in medical facilities, much as many are today, and also in poorhouses. And then you can see here the development of some facilities in Williamsburg, Virginia, as I mentioned, Friends Hospital in Philadelphia. And then what happened is one of the people in charge of Pennsylvania Hospital, Thomas Kirkbride, they developed something called the Kirkbride Plan, and you see a setup here of this. This is actually an early blueprint of what became Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, which was the first hospital built according to what was called the Kirkbride Plan. Kirkbride Plan was very progressive for its time, even today, featuring rooms, outside areas, day rooms with lots of windows in it. Most state psychiatric hospitals that you see now are still designed with that Kirkbride plan in mind. Again, very progressive for its time. Now, not progressive at the time was the treatment that was available. And this picture comes from Williamsburg. You can see a straitjacket here. There's an electroshock device in the back. And then something, the box in the front, which someone would be put in, and it would actually be, they would be locked in there. There were some versions where a person could have their arms and legs out, but they would be connected to the floor. There are other ones. I mean, to me, this looks like a coffin with screens in it. But these were the means that were available at the time. Most treatment took the form of seclusion, physical restraint, involuntary surgery. In fact, I believe you can look up the history at Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. Dr. Cotton, I believe, was a big fan of involuntary surgery. They were bleeding people, withholding food. I can only imagine what electroshock therapy was like back in the 1800s. I mean, think about where surgery was, at this time, people taking ether and biting down on something while they are having limbs amputated. So this, I affectionately refer to it as the Stone Age. However, it was not really that long ago, where we were talking about 200 years. So despite this, these hospitals became extremely popular to the point, as we'll see, where over 500,000 Americans were actually in these state psychiatric hospitals. What happens is they became very crowded, they became very violent, and what they were realizing was that they really weren't serving their purpose as effectively as they could. And it really wasn't about people getting better and getting released. It was more about long-term, I don't want to say storage, but I'm going to say it, storage of people with mental illness. If you ever seen the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, it gives you a nice illustration of that. So in the 1950s, a bunch of things started to happen to start to stem the tide from putting people in these state psychiatric hospitals. Thorazine, the first psychiatric medication, was invented and began use in the 1950s. Nursing homes were developed, so there were other facilities so that people became medically compromised, that they could live there instead of these hospitals. The development of Social Security, both the SSDI and SSI, Medicare, Medicaid, the ability for people to have insurance and to have money. Having an illness, much like people had with medical illnesses, was critical so that people could live in the community. The Community Mental Health Center Act, to ensure that people had treatment, whether you had insurance or not, psychiatric treatment would be available everywhere in the country. And then a more recent development was something called the Olmstead legislation, which is where people are regularly reviewed to see, do they really need to be in the hospitals anymore? What are the barriers to that person's discharge, and how can we get that person back in the community again? And that's had an amazing impact on the census of these state psychiatric hospitals. So what you see here is a 93% decrease in the census from 1955 into the 2000s to the present day. And over a third of these hospitals have closed as well. And it's interesting that the numbers have changed so much. So such an overwhelming majority of people, but not as many hospitals closed. I think that's interesting. And for the most part, that's been really good. The Harding study in Vermont showed that the majority of people released from the hospital did well, didn't return to the hospital, were either able to function without services or with community services. Now that funding was being diverted into the community instead of the majority of it going into the hospitals. However, the story is not all rosy here. What happens is that there are over 383,000 Americans today in jails and prisons. To my knowledge, the three largest concentrations of people with severe and persistent mental illness are all correctional facilities now: Rikers Island, the Cook County Jail in Illinois, and the LA County Jail. So a blessing and a curse about how deinstitutionalization has gone. But it has put more treatment and more money into the community where people are, and less into these hospitals. So I brought this up just so you could see, you take a look at your state and see how many hospitals it has. Some states have many state psychiatric hospitals. Some of them have very few. Only one state has none. They contract with another state. And I imagine we will be seeing more states with just one in the future, but that's a guesstimate on my part. So what started to happen was one of the consequences of cutting down lengths of stay and discharging people was readmission. So we find 1 in 7 people that are discharged from a state psychiatric facility are readmitted within 30 days, and about 1 in 2 are readmitted within 365 days. That gave birth to something that was referred to as the revolving door. And if there are any Godfather fans out there, this is a picture of the revolving door that was used in the Godfather movie. So, and of course, readmissions are particularly difficult. They're very hard on patients. They're very hard on families. They're also very difficult for hospitals and outpatient services. Very expensive, and they jam up the system in addition to the human cost. In fact, I'm doing my dissertation on the subject pretty much as we speak. So just to give an idea of how this system works in the state of New Jersey is divided into 3 regions. I know we can talk about that. New Jersey is a very small state, and one of the quickest ways to start a fight in New Jersey is to suggest whether there's either 2 or 3 sections to New Jersey. But according to the state, there's 3 sections. In the northern region, we have Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in Morris County. In the central region, we have Trenton Psychiatric Hospital in Mercer County. And on the grounds of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital is our forensic hospital. So that's right there. So that's sort of a 2-in-1. And in the southern region, it's Ancora Psychiatric Hospital, which is in Hamilton. I think it's right on the edge of Camden. It's in Camden County, on the edge of Atlantic County. And in addition to that, there were a few other psychiatric hospitals. If you've been around the system a while, you know of these: Marlborough Psychiatric and Hagedorn Psychiatric Hospital, both of which were closed during the time I've been in the field. So these hospitals face a lot of issues. They have a rough job to do. Let's start out with the idea that they treat the most mentally ill people at their absolute most ill. Let's start with that. In addition to that, these are very big hospitals. They tend to be isolated. They're a world unto themselves. And until recently, they didn't really work with the rest of the community mental health system as much as would be beneficial, and other services on the outside. Hospitals keep people out as well as they keep people in. The civil service issue, I don't want to go into great detail about that, but it at times has prioritized seniority over achievement. So that's a complicated issue. There's a civil service exam that people have to pass, and some jobs are posted within. I could go on a whole rant about that, but it does make things a little more difficult in terms of making quick changes. State psychiatric hospitals also are responsible for a lot of things that were way out of their purview. People have been sent to state psychiatric hospitals for medical issues, for organic issues, for addictions, for intellectual disabilities. Going way back in the day, it was a way that rich men would get no-fault divorces from their wives. They would just commit them to the hospital, and then they didn't have to give them half of their stuff. So that's one of the ways that this has been misused. Also, people that are homeless have an increased chance of being put in a state psychiatric hospital. We have lots of people that are undocumented in the psychiatric hospital, so they're not eligible for services. So lots of challenges there. Some of the newer challenges have been COVID-19. Fortunately, in New Jersey, we got through. We did lose staff and we did lose patients, but not at the kind of numbers that you saw in nursing facilities. And subsequent to that, we had a lot of staff retire and not come back. And at this point in time, in 2022, we are desperately trying to refill staff positions because there's a lot you can't do when you don't have the staff to actually carry it out. My favorite way of capturing the challenges of a psychiatric hospital is from my colleague, Dr. Jeff Ewell, who once said, "We built a better mousetrap, and now God has built a better mouse." And I think working in this field is that process is always going on. We get better, and then the clients that we see become more complicated as well. Nowadays, they may have a mental illness, a substance abuse problem, medical problems, immigration problems, and legal problems, all of which need to be sorted out as part of their care. One of the other interesting things about a state psychiatric hospital is the way they're set up. So what I've listed here are the disciplines or the departments that comprise a state psychiatric hospital. And there's this little strange thing, you see the little graphic here. One of the consequences of the ways it's set up is that the people with the least education spend the most time with the patients. And the ones that have the most education spend the least time with the patients. And part of that is because of expense. And then some of that is just how it's set up. So human service techs or human service assistants, called HSTs or HSAs, spend the majority, if not all of their time with the patients in the hospital. The other departments may see them for an hour here, an hour there, or the rehab department actually does programming for anywhere, it can be 15, 20 or more hours per week. So they will spend a lot of time with the patients. But it is sort of an upside down pyramid. So the most ill get the less contact with the people who are, the most educated. So that's sort of a design flaw in this system. So I put this up here just as a comparison. This is a list of the top 10 most frequent diagnoses in Ankline to the left, which is the forensic hospital, and Ancora to the right, which is a civil psychiatric hospital, or non-forensic, meaning that people don't have charges on them. So if you look, they're actually pretty similar, but they have some important differences as well. So schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, which we've discussed in the DSM-5 video. If you haven't seen that, that's probably a good next one to go to. But then as you move down, you'll start to see some changes. In a forensic facility, you'll see more of antisocial personality disorder. And you see more of the addictions going on, but you do see them on both sides. The italicized ones are the ones that are in one hospital's top 10 list, but not quite in the other. But you'll get an idea of the range of treatment that's provided. You see treatment for personality disorders here, intellectual disabilities, addictions, as well as psychosis, which is the majority of what these hospitals do. And that's originally what they were designed to do. So, of course, the number one priority in any hospital is safety. Safety for both the patients and the staff. So one of the things that's happening in the hospitals as we speak now is the development of something called medical security officers, or MSOs. These were staff that were only in the forensic hospital and are now moving into the civil hospitals as well. This is more of a security aspect. I talked about the HSTs and HSAs before. This adds more of a security aspect to it, to keep the patients and staff safer. One of the realities of the situation is our population is becoming more jail and prison oriented. That comes along with the increase in addictions. So there's a little bit more of the jail and prison culture coming in. And so this is an attempt to address that. However, the priority right along with safety is recovery, getting people better, getting people out of the hospital so that they can function out of the hospital and hopefully not return. Other priorities include restraint reduction, physical restraints such as wrist and ankle restraints, as well as chemical restraint, medicating people to sedate people so that they won't be violent or dangerous to themselves or to other people. Again, recovering from the staff issues of COVID, getting programming going again, which was deeply affected during COVID. I'm writing a paper about that right now. And also developing something called the clinical formulary, which is a series of treatments, some of which have an evidence base to them. Some of them are about trauma-informed care. So we're really looking to make this the core of programming in the hospitals, again, to help people get better and to help them get out of the hospital and stay out of the hospital. So just to do a quick plug here, particularly for the football team. So one of the things that we did in New Jersey is the state psychiatric hospitals have a hospital affiliation with Rutgers University. So for example, I'm the faculty consultant at Ancora and Ankline Forensic Centers, but we have people in all of the hospitals. And the idea is to bring our expertise, our knowledge, and our resources to the hospital to try to improve the quality of care there and working conditions. And of course, we have to publish, a faculty and all that. We got to do that. And hopefully we're doing a better job than our football team. Although the football team's getting better, truth be told. So we've had some successes. The work is never over, and we can always do better than what we're doing. However, these were some of the successes, and some of these things I've written on and published on. This material's out there. The development of treatment malls, the development of wellness centers in the state psychiatric hospitals, having more involvement from the community providers on site. As we mentioned, the census has gone down significantly. The census at Ancora is less than half of what it was when I got there in 2006. A lot of good work by the staff in making that happen. Reducing physical restraint, using clinical analytics. That is, just to break it down, looking at maybe the top 10 people that are giving you a problem in a certain area and then really aggressively working on those and using the data to improve performance. And what we've noticed is as we've used that data and as we've been able to treat people better, and then that helps facilitate discharge. Give you an example, we had a patient who was restrained over 500 times, physically restrained over 500 times, managed to get a month without physical restraint, and the person was ultimately discharged to a residential facility and has not been back. Specialized units. Having units targeted specifically towards someone's needs, a DBT unit, for example, dialectical behavior therapy, or an IST unit for people that are incompetent to stand trial so that they can come in, get their competency established, and get out of the hospital. Geriatric units, positive behavioral support units to work with people that have been in the hospital a long time or possibly have some intellectual disabilities. By making these specialized units, you can put someone in a unit that will actually target what their specific needs are instead of it just being more of a general, housing sort of situation, or being by geography, which is how it's been done in the past. And also trauma-informed care, which we cover in other presentations here. Absolutely vital. These hospital settings can actually create trauma in people or reactivate pre-existing trauma. So we can't put this as a high enough priority in people's care. So in short, the mental health system is a series of increasingly restrictive environments, and none more restrictive than the psychiatric hospitals. These hospitals have been around for over 150 years, and there's been an upward swing and a downward swing in terms of their census and their popularity. In fact, a really good question to ask is whether these hospitals will continue to provide a necessary function, or have they outlived their usefulness? Great question to ask and debate. Deinstitutionalization has had positive results, but it's also created some additional challenges, such as we mentioned readmissions and transcarceration when someone goes into another facility from a psychiatric facility because that psychiatric facility is closed, like a criminal justice facility. Readmissions is an issue that all hospitals face, and something that we're aggressively working on now. State psychiatric hospitals have numerous challenges, as we've detailed, some of which have absolutely nothing to do with mental health. Some of them have to do with public policy, such as homelessness and immigration. Those things end up in anything in society that we don't have an answer for probably ends up in a state psychiatric hospital at some point in time. And what we did not discuss, and probably could discuss more effectively, is how marginalized populations end up in state psychiatric hospitals in greater numbers. That's a whole other subject. Maybe we'll address that another time. New Jersey state psychiatric hospitals have come a long way in the time I've been working with them. I've been working with them peripherally for about 30 years and much more directly in the last 16 years. And I've seen a lot of progress there. There's a long way to go, but there's been a lot of progress made. And I also want to give a lot of credit to the people who work in those hospitals, particularly through COVID-19. People who came to work not knowing if they were bringing this illness into their homes from work or bringing it into work from home. I cannot give enough credit to people who've done that. So here are a lot of the resources, including the papers that I've done on some of these subjects that we've talked about, and a paper by my colleagues, Russ Smith and Tom Bartholomew. That's a great paper. The last line on here is the Rutgers YouTube channel, where we have all of these trainings. So if you got this one on my channel under Ken Kinter, you can go to this site and you can look it up, and there are versions there that have tests that you can take, post-tests, and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of additional resources on there beyond just the videos. So anyway, it's been nice talking to you again, and I hope to catch up with you again very soon. You take care.